Ladies and gentlemen, warlord is a word rather like our currency. It's much depreciated. Nowadays we use warlord about almost any general or almost any political leader who rules in a dictatorial way. The true warlord was a man of unique power, dominating both the military and civil affairs of his country. A dictator whose power was unlimited and who made all the vital decisions. Attila the Hun was a warlord of a primitive kind. Napoleon was a warlord. In the First World War, curiously enough, there were no warlords. Lloyd George liked to call himself the man who won the war, but he did so despite great opposition from the generals, and he was very rarely able to get his own way. Even the German generals, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, though often called warlords, operated within fairly strict limits. The Second World War, on the other hand, though we call it, and rightly call it, the People's War, was also the war of the warlords. Of the 6 great powers involved in the Second World War, all except one had a single acknowledged leader from whom all the basic decisions and forces sprang. These are the men whom I'm going to talk about for the next 6 weeks. And tonight I want to talk about the first of them, or at any rate the first of the modern dictators, though by no means the most successful, and because the first perhaps less effective. Benito Mussolini, the leader, duce, dictator if you like, of Italy. Mussolini was the senior. He operated altogether for some 20 years and introduced, in a sense, the modern conception of dictatorship which claimed, at any rate, to spring from the people, not to be imposed from above by a monarch. Mussolini was very much a man of the people himself. His father had been a blacksmith. He, when young, was a revolutionary socialist. If Bolshevik had been, in the early 20th century, a term applied outside Russia, Mussolini would have been called a Bolshevik. But with the First World War, he broke with his socialist comrades, and though still calling himself a man of the left, championed the war. He served, and this is an interesting point to ask of each of these warlords, what did he know of war? Mussolini served in the trenches, and the Italian trenches were perhaps the worst trenches in Europe, the harshest conditions, the one where nothing was done for the ordinary men. He served in the trenches for 2 years. He was then invalided out because of a wound, and came back into politics at the end of the First World War. It was then that he broke with his socialist comrades. He organized, it was originally a group simply of ex-servicemen, in Italian, a fascio, fascist party, which was the party he invented, merely means an organized group of people. The significant thing about what Mussolini did was that he transformed this group of ordinary ex-servicemen into a group used as strike breakers, attacking the cooperatives, attacking the trade unions, cooperating with the employers to resist the revolutionary working class movement. A couple of years later, by 1922, Mussolini had built up an aggressive political party, and he threatened somewhat grandiloquently that the forces of this fascist party, who incidentally wore black shirts, that's where the name came from, would march on Rome. This is a rather mythical event, I may say. There was a great deal more talk of the march and Italian crowds surging around in their own towns than there was real march. The march on Rome, and this I think is a parable of much of Mussolini's career, was in fact conducted in a sleeping car by train, because when there was so much disturbance, the king succumbed. The army said they didn't want to be used in civil disputes. The king said the only alternative then is to make Mussolini prime minister. Mussolini was summoned to Rome. He didn't march there. He went by train overnight. He stepped into his sleeping carriage in black shirt, and he emerged at Rome with top hat and frock coat. He had been transformed, one would think, into the respectable prime minister of Italy. And indeed, for the first 2 or 3 years, he was by no means a dictator. He was playing the game of parliament, building up coalitions. It was only gradually that he used the illegal force of the fascist party, the beating up of opponents, the beginnings, in a very cautious way, of a reign of terror, that he arrived at a dictatorial position. And the final thing which carried him to dictatorship was the murder of one of his most courageous opponents, Matteotti, a socialist. This murder shook the prestige of the regime. Mussolini himself lost his nerve. And then, because his opponents were ineffective, resumed and established the single-party state which existed from 1925 till his fall in 1943. He himself, as well as Prime Minister, acquired the official title of leader, Duce, the first time that such a title had been used, except in purely military terms. And this was his justification for claiming supreme power. If we consider Italian policy thereafter from 1925, yes, it all turned on Mussolini, but it turned in a rather casual way. When it came to government, he was a lazy man. I've turned over pages of the Foreign Office documents which were sent to Mussolini. He sat there with his vast desk, almost empty of papers, because all he did was to write at the end of every 2 or 3 which he'd pick up, important, importanti. This is the only comment he ever made, so you didn't have to work frightfully hard in judging foreign affairs if this was the only judgment. What he did was to create an impression of power. Just as he had bluffed himself into political power, so I think you can say he bluffed Italy, and himself as Duce of Italy, into the position of being a great power. He was the only European ruler of the 1920s who talked openly in terms of great military power. When other countries were pursuing, or alleged that they were pursuing, disarmament, Italy was launching a new great rearmament program. All the political demonstrations in Mussolini's Italy were of an apparently military kind. He was one of the first modern politicians to use the cinema as a political weapon. Marches of apparently highly disciplined troops or young people, demonstrations of Italian might in the air, demonstrations of the great Italian Navy. Most of these things were in fact demonstrations and not much else. Italy was, after all, a poor country, and the actual expenditure on rearmament had to be restricted all the time. Mussolini believed that show would carry the day. I think one can say a bit more than that. He was deluded, he was led astray himself by the shows that he put on. As he looked at these masses of marching troops shown to him on the screen, he really believed that Italy had an army of 5 million. I think the actual figure was not much more than 1 million when it came to the point. The 5 million was a phrase he had once used, and he used it so often that it got into his own head. In exactly the same way, he came to believe that Italy had the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean. At the same time, he played his role as a European statesman. He was accepted by others. British statesmen such as Sir Austen Chamberlain not only sent him Christmas cards, they actually joined him on holiday with his family. This aristocratic Englishman, Mussolini, the son of a blacksmith, exchanging greetings and treating each other as equals. Mussolini probably despised them most, but nevertheless, he came to enjoy a unique position of respect in Europe. The very stability of his regime, or so it appeared. And it's not difficult to have a stable regime if you put all your opponents in prison and threaten to beat up others who cause trouble. The very stability of his regime, the fact that he'd been in power so long, led people to think that he'd become a senior statesman, a man of great wisdom, always consulted. The new phase of Mussolini's life came, of course, with the rise of a second fascist dictator, Hitler, a man of a very different character, whom I shall be talking about incidentally next week. much stronger and with much greater resources behind him. This is a curious thing. Mussolini, with such few resources, was yet the one man whom Hitler genuinely accepted, at any rate in the early days, as an equal. And I think one can say whom Hitler genuinely took seriously. The conferences which they held together, though they look now to us so comical, were demonstrations, at any rate on Hitler's side, of great power. And Mussolini himself was dragged forward into becoming more assertive, more aggressive, simply because of the challenge from his fellow or rival dictator. Mussolini, incidentally, always displayed, I was going to say, the physical attributes of dictatorship. He was, although not tall, extremely powerful. And in the intervals of displaying his troops, he would display himself as a powerful rider, horse jumper. He would also love showing off his physical prowess when the unemployed had been set to work clearing the Pontine marshes. Mussolini often turned up, stripped to the waist, and would then join them, digging away, showing that he was as tough and strong as he had been when he was a young blacksmith or a blacksmith's son himself. Mussolini was one of the first, and here there were elements of judgment, who fully appreciated the danger from a reviving Germany, and at one time was associated with Great Britain and France in some sort of plan by which they hoped to check Germany. Two things pulled Mussolini the other way, and these were his two great decisions which affected the fate of Italy throughout the Second World War and for many years thereafter. The first decision was that in order to increase Italian power, he launched a war in Abyssinia and conquered Abyssinia within a very short time. Although he himself had little to do with the plans, again, his was the final decision both to make the war and, when it was on, to press it on more urgently. His general in command hesitated and said it'll take 2 years. Mussolini said, we can't wait that long, you must finish it this season. And he succeeded, so that his first great military order was vindicated by success. The second decision he made was this, of a far graver nature. If he adhered to what one might call the allied side of Great Britain and France, Italy would be in the front line and would be overwhelmed by German power before Great Britain and France could do anything to help her. If, on the other hand, he associated himself with Hitler, then he would be carried to success and would not, his own bluff, as it were, would not be exposed. In 1936, he established the confidential relations with Hitlerite Germany, which was to be called the axis on which Europe then was supposed to revolve. And from that time on, Mussolini, despite his constant alarms, despite the apprehensions that Italy would not be able to carry her weight, would not remain a great power when faced with the challenge of war, Mussolini was tied to Hitler's side. His last great moment, I suppose, was the conference at Munich in 1938, because after all, it was he who proposed it. He appeared as the supremely great independent statesman negotiating between Germany on the one hand, Great Britain and France on the other. The actual Munich Agreement is what Mussolini pulled out of his bag. It's fair to say it had been given to him by the Germans first, but he didn't reveal this. He, as the impartial arbitrator, said, this is the deal that we should make, and the others accepted it. For a little time, he enjoyed the fame of a peacemaker, a fame as undeserved as any of the others. On September 1939, war broke out between Germany on the one side and England and France on the other. Mussolini evaded the challenge. He explained to Hitler that while he was entirely on Germany's side, Italy was not ready. He said, we need another 3 years. And Hitler, who saw more clearly that Italy was no great asset, accepted this. But 9 months later, when France fell, Mussolini was afraid that he was going to be left out of the war. And here was again the decision entirely his own The king was against war, the generals were against war, Ciano, the foreign minister, was against war. Mussolini thought, unless I go to war now, before France collapses, I shall have missed the boat. Later on, he complained that it was all the others for war, and he said, somewhat cynically, I was the only pacifist. But I think he was really exaggerating. Italy went to war under Mussolini with the belief that the war was over. She'd come out with large prizes and no efforts. Instead, although the French collapsed, Great Britain continued, won the Battle of Britain, and with that, with Germany secure for the time being in Europe, all the weight of British pressure fell on Italy. It is, I think, no exaggeration to say that from June or from August 1940 until the middle of 1943, the Second World War, so far as Great Britain was concerned, was mainly a war against Italy, not against Germany, and it was a war which Italy could not sustain. Mussolini accumulated mistakes. Again, they were all his. Without doubt, his was the idea of an offensive campaign in North Africa, which within a few months brought the Italian army to disaster. His, even more alarming, was the decision, having annexed Albania, to invade Greece. He did this for a very characteristic reason. He said he was tired of getting messages every day from Hitler saying, I have started a war with somebody. He said, this time I'll be able to send a message to Hitler saying, I've started a war with somebody, I've invaded Greece. This was an exaggeration, because as soon as the Italians advanced from Albania, the Greeks pushed them back. Hitler was later to claim, in fact, that Mussolini's invasion or declaration of war against Greece lost him the war, because with the increasing disasters of the Italian forces in Greece, Germans had to go to the assistance of the Italians and thus postponed the invasion of Russia. This is a somewhat speculative view. I think it's an excuse which Hitler gave thereafter. The best view nowadays, which is mine, I may say, as well as that of other people, or shall I say other people as well as mine, is that the German assistance to Greece, which led to the complete conquest of Greece and of Yugoslavia too, did not, in fact, have any decisive effect in delaying the German invasion of Russia. But at any rate, from this moment, Italy, really you could say, had lost the war. She was only kept in the war by German support, by German troops, first of all in Greece, and then increasingly, of course, by German troops in North Africa, by Rommel and what was called the Africa Corps. By the end of 1942, it was quite clear that North Africa was going to be lost, and that Italy, from every point of view, from the naval point of view, from the military point of view, was a defeated power. In the early months of 1943, the only question, well, the practical question was, would the Allies invade Italy? They did so. They landed in Sicily. But inside Italy, the only practical question was, how could Italy get out of the war? Mussolini himself admitted that she must do so. Ostensibly, he was commander-in-chief, a position he'd given himself at the beginning of the war in 1940. In fact, he had completely lost control of the war. He told his closest associates that he was going to tell Hitler the war was over, Italy must get out. But when he had his last meeting, or his last meeting as Duce with Hitler at Feltre, he couldn't bring himself to say it. And when he came back to Rome, he said the war must go on. There were a series of conspiracies, of groups. Some generals said they would get rid of Mussolini. Some politicians said they would get rid of Mussolini. The king said he would get rid of Mussolini. None of them did so. In the end, curiously enough, Mussolini got rid of himself. The Grand Council, as it was called, of fascists met. The great majority expressed a lack of confidence in Mussolini. Mussolini said angrily, "You're provoked a crisis of the regime." But he didn't indicate he was going to take their advice. The next day, he went to the king and said, the Grand Council has lost confidence in me. I resign as commander-in-chief. Someone else can carry on the war. He thought he would stay as Duce, but the king had already prepared what one might call a coup d'etat. Mussolini was arrested or stopped by police as he left the palace, put into an ambulance so that nobody noticed, and was exiled to an island. A little later, that was August 1943, the new Italian government, which was not fascism, collapsed overnight. Not a single fascist attempted to resist the regime which had lasted 20 years and had boasted itself of such power. It simply fell down like a house of cards, which is all Mussolini was. The Italian rulers, however, were afraid that Mussolini might be grabbed by Allied raids from an island. They moved him to a mountain. There they thought at the top of a mountain, in a sort of spa health resort, he would be secure. But by a daring operation, German paratroops landed on the mountain, rescued Mussolini, and took him to Munich. You can see a film of him arriving, an absolutely broken, shattered man. All he said all he wanted to do was to go to his country home and spend his time in retirement at Rocca in Comanche. Mussolini would not allow it. Once a dictator, he said, always a dictator. He insisted that Mussolini should go back. And there was then a sort of a shadow, an imitation of fascism, set up in northern Italy on Lake Garda at a place called Salo, so it's called the Republic of Salo. Mussolini once more claimed to be Duce. The Italian Social Republic, he said, should this time be really a republic of the left. He went back to his old left-wing ideas. They didn't apply them very much. He said, what a mistake I made in allowing the king and the aristocracy and the capitalists to survive. I thought I could control them. I ought to rub them out and ruled in the name of the workers of Italy. He had a council of ministers. The Italian Minister of War was even allowed to raise a few troops. In fact, Mussolini's power did not extend outside the wretched hall where the Council of Ministers met. Lake of Garda is up in the mountains. It rained most of the time, and Mussolini used to stare out through the rain and say, we're all dead. He wasn't allowed to move without a German controller. Parts of Italy, South Tyrol, Trieste, were transferred from Italian to German control. He saw that the things which he'd, far from gaining, he was losing territory for Italy. The Italian army had no real existence. Some of the troops acted as auxiliaries to the Germans. Most of them were not allowed to act at all. The only thing which Mussolini was compelled to do was to put on trial those fascists who had expressed lack of confidence in him and have them all sentenced to death, among them his own son-in-law Ciano. And he did not resist. The life had gone out of him. He had one last moment of grandeur. On July the 25th, 1944, there was a bomb attempt on Hitler's life. Hitler was a shattered man. Here again, you can see this in a film. His left arm completely paralyzed. And exactly at that moment, Mussolini arrived on a visit. He stepped out of the train, shambling and inferior, and at last saw Hitler down and himself up. And one of the most delightful touches in any war film is to see Mussolini swelling up, patting Hitler on the shoulder, as it were, and saying, well, it isn't so bad after all, I'll stand by you. That was the last meeting in grandeur of the two dictators. In the beginning of 1945, strange enough, Mussolini was still enormously popular. He had great meetings in Milan, great cheering crowds, but as the Allies advanced and as the Italian partisans rose, Hitler knew that everything was lost. At the last minute, he tried to negotiate with the partisans to surrender, even talked as though he himself had always been anti-German and should be welcomed as the first of the partisans. He got no welcome from them. And at that moment, he learnt that the German forces were withdrawing from Milan. He felt that they were betraying him because he existed only from them. By then, it's fair to say he'd lost any sense of reality. Where, if he tried to escape, where was he to escape to? He was simply on the move. He'd left Salo on the Lake of Garda because he thought he could discuss with somebody in Milan. Now, although he'd met the partisan leaders, they had nothing to offer him. Indeed, they had warned him that he was regarded as their public enemy. And at the last minute, he joined a German convoy which was setting up through the Alps back into Germany. Convoy of trucks and of tanks. In the narrow roads along Lake Como, they were held up by a partisan barrier. The German tanks could have shot their way through, but they didn't want any more trouble. They wanted to go home. And the Italians said, all right, we'll let you go through on condition you're not taking any Italians with you. And as they searched the trucks, they found a man in a German greatcoat. They pulled him out. It was Mussolini. There were other Italian ministers who were also caught on the same convoy. They were pulled out. The partisans had no doubt at all what to do with the ministers. They took them down to the nearest town and shot them that evening. But Mussolini was too big a fish for them. And so they took him up and concealed him in a farm building well off the road. By, I was going to say a strange chance, but it's not true. By deliberation, Mussolini was joined by his mistress, Clara Petacci. Before this time, Mussolini had made a last farewell from his family, told them that all was over. He tried to do his best for Italy. They should not come with him. But Clara Petacci, who had been his mistress for a very long time, I may say not the only mistress Mussolini had had by any means, pursued him, joined up with him, and was also interned in the farmhouse. The next morning, a partisan communist leader who was driving up the valley heard that there was some significantly great fascist hidden up in the mountains. He had armed himself with a warrant, somewhat speculative perhaps, entitling him to deal with Mussolini as he saw best. So he and a friend drove their lorry up to the farmhouse. Mussolini and Clara Petacci, because there was nowhere else for them to be, were in bed. They got out. Mussolini, believing he was being rescued, said to the communist leader, "You have come to rescue me. I will give you an empire," the last of his illusions or pretenses. Clara Petacci, more practically minded, was fumbling under the bedclothes. The partisan thought she was looking for a gun. He said, "What are you doing?" She said, "I'm looking for my knickers." They were taken out to a nearby quarry. Mussolini was stood against a wall. When Clara saw that they were going to shoot him, she stood in front of him. They were both shot dead. Their bodies were left there for some hours. Then they were taken down to Milan. And the violence displayed against their bodies was so great that to avoid the crowd, they were hung upside down outside a garage. A shot that can be often seen, which signifies, in a sense, Mussolini's end. This poor Mussolini, as someone said, he'd always, one can feel the way, upside down, a man doomed to failure. After a day or two, somebody managed to lay hold to rescue the body. It was taken away and hidden for some years in a monastery. Incidentally, the treasures which Mussolini carried with him were never found, if indeed they existed. Some years later, Mussolini's body was quietly moved to a family grave where it now obscurely rests.
AJP Taylor's series on the warlords continues next on BBC4 with Adolf Hitler.